that is going to do just that. And I'm going to do it from scratch. So, we're going to go ahead and kick this off with an intro to theory crafting. So, we'll go ahead and start fresh here. My build technically is actually here, the Regen the Darkness build, but we're going to actually start from a clean, fresh ground zero. And this will be highlighted in my channel after the stream, so that way I can archive it for people to come back to later. Alright, so, first thing you want to do with theory crafting is make sure you know what you want your character to do. Alright, so if you want a bosser, are you just simply focused on bosses? Are you very specifically looking at the Shaper or Elder or even Uber Elder fights? Because all of these different conditions need to go into your build. For example, if you are a Juggernaut whose intention is to focus farm Elder, then you would actually want this node right here, Unstoppable, because the cannot be slowed below base speed, movement speed cannot be modified to below base value, actually gives you slow and freeze immunity effectively. If you have like positive movement speed because of like 30 movement speed boots or something like that, like you could technically lose that, but you are freeze immune because freeze makes you 0 speed. And the Elder fight features a lot of really heavy slow mechanics, and something like this can greatly increase your survivability in the Elder fight by allowing you to kind of ignore some of the mechanics that can trip players up during fights. If you were looking for a character who is going to be, say, living in burial chambers, you're going to set up a tier 3 loop on your Atlas, so that way you could just 24/7 farm burial chambers nonstop with never ever having to like change maps or anything. You're just only ever thinking about running burial chambers and infinitely sustaining them. Then you would be looking at a build that wouldn't need as much life as a traditional build because you're only going to be going up to tier 3 content. You're not going to be pushing into the higher monster levels where, you know, normally you want like 180% increased maximum life on build. Well, if you're going to live in burial chambers, you know, you're probably fine with like 140. You're not needing all that extra survivability because you're never really fighting content too high of a level above you. And then on top of that, because you don't need to spec so much into survivability, and your singular goal is just doing more burial chambers per hour because you're trying to farm that headhunter or whatever, you can put the points that you would normally invest in the survivability into either more damage or movement speed. And oftentimes, this is a build where you'll see something like a KB Deadeye that farms up burial chambers. You're going to pick up, you know, all of Quickstep. You're going to pick up all of this. You're going to pick up Aspect of the Eagle because it has movement speed. You're going to grab this movement speed. If you actually go ahead and search movement speed in Path of Building down here at the bottom, you would more than likely, you'd have all of Quickstep. You'd have these two nodes going through Heart of the Oak. You'd have this right here. You might go even as far out to this if you really want to. You can easily come down and grab Celerity here. It gives you attack speed too, and more movement speed. And then if you're like, let's say, a Wind Ripper character, you're going to grab this arc right here to get bow damage and more movement speed. Because all you care about is, like, you're going to have more than enough damage to glass tier 3 enemies. You don't care. You're decked out in quant and you just want to be running burial chambers all day. So maps per hour is so much more important than anything else because you're not thinking about red tier maps or needing to worry about survivability. Hell, when you're farming burial chambers, you largely don't even need to care about elemental weakness, as it's not a modifier that will roll on your map ever, being that white maps don't roll. Players are cursed modifiers. You might experience the curse from time to time from like the necromancers that float around with the undead, but it's not at the forefront to the point where you should like, oh, I need to get like 109% resistance on my gear or whatever. You don't need to care about that. Like it's not a factor. So, knowing what your goal is for your build to accomplish is so important going in, because it tells you, what do I want to look for on the tree? Do I need the extra survivability because of the content that I'm doing? Do I need to maybe invest in more damage or a different like set of damage? Like if you're a poison build, you're going to need to pick up the poison nodes, even though a normal attack crit build might ignore them. Do you need movement speed? All these things kind of go into your build. So, with that in mind, we are going to make a build that is fully focused on Delve. We're going to map because we have to map to get our Voltaxic Sulfite. Unfortunately, that's just a fact of life. But this character specifically is going to be made to focus on the mines, the encounters in it, and more importantly, exploring the darkness on the side paths. As you've seen on my streams so far with Caustic Arrow, we're doing a pretty good job of kind of getting our stuff, our goodies out of the side areas. It's not really too big of a hindrance. And that's great. Like, it's been feeling wonderful. But I want a build that can literally just walk into the darkness and not give a fuck at all. Straight up, doesn't give a shit at all. Whatever. Darkness, cool. I don't even feel it. That's the level that I want. And actually, we're gonna switch from Path of Building to Display Capture. Okay. What we're gonna do is we're gonna move Display Capture up towards where Path of Building is. There we go. So now the Display Capture will kind of go over all of the little widgets that I have on my stream. Alright, so as I said, our main focus here is going to be ignoring the darkness. That in mind, the way that I'm choosing to ignore the darkness is through a very recovery and regeneration-centric build. So, when you're thinking about recovery, regeneration, and just being overall tanky, you think about Juggernaut, and that is exactly what we are going to play. So, we're going to go ahead and set this up as Marauder Juggernaut. And Ascendancies, you're always going to take Endurance Charge on your Juggernaut. Like, if you're a Juggernaut, you want Endurance Charges, you want all the extra defense that you get. And we're also going to juice up our Endurance Charges, because that's going to also help us with the damage that we're going to take from enemies, but not so much the darkness. Now, where we go from here. So, we've got Undeniable. This is a pretty nice node if you're like a crit jug, but we're not going to be doing crit. Unstoppable's nice because you get the extra movement speed. You can't be stunned. You can't be slowed, all that jazz. We're not going to worry about this either. It's pretty much the lowest value. This node gives us regen, but then not only does it give us regen and reduce damage taken, but then it also gives us more regen based on the physical damage prevented from hits in the past 10 seconds. Great, that's actually what we're looking for. And then we have Unyielding. And Unyielding is kind of just our last node here. It gives us damage, it gives us AoE, and it gives us some endurance charge generation, but we're not really worried about that. But it's going to help our damage in our area of effect. So, kind of gets that sorted out of the way. Now, where you go next can be kind of up in the air. So, I know that I want to be a regen-centric build, but what I don't know right now is, what am I going to do as a build? Well, one thing I have in mind, wanting to be regen-centric, is that we're going to run Vitality as an aura. So, we can start by plugging that in. Now, all things considered, Vitality is honestly kind of mediocre. It doesn't feel much, but I'll explain in a minute why it is what we want. Now, what are we going to attack with? Well, the only thing I can answer there is what weapon we're going to use. We're going to use the Soul Taker. I want to reserve as much of my mana as humanly possible. I want every little drip of mana that I can afford reserved into auras, and then Soul Taker allows us to, for melee attacks, completely ignore if we run out of mana. We can have 0 mana and we can still just swing away with our attack like nothing is even happening. Also, it doesn't hurt that at 306 physical DPS and 1.8 attacks per second, Soul Taker is one of your better options as a one-handed weapon anyhow. So it's pretty good to have, and we're not going to worry about the rolls. We'll just go ahead and take a mid-tier roll. So, that being said, Soul Taker automatically, 100%, that's what we're going to use. Now, going beyond that, what are we going to use the rest of our mana for? Well, we're for sure going to run a Blasphemy Curse. That will bring us up to 70% mana reserved. Why does Vitality reserve... Oh, 36 because it can't round correctly. Ah, okay. So we're going to run Blasphemy. Now, what we put here, we're going to come back to that later, because we're going to have to figure out what attack are we going to do? Are we a Double Striker? Are we a Lacerator? Are we a Smite character? Now that Smite's fancy and pretty freaking good, all things considered, regardless of whether you're a minion build or not. Are we Infernal Blow? All of these things might want different curses. If you're a Lacerate or a Double Strike character, you know both of those builds kind of want bleed interaction. Double Strike gets a huge amount of flat added fizz from an enemy being inflicted with bleed, and Lacerate just has a % more multiplier when hitting bleeding targets. In those cases, because we're going to be a bleed build, and bleed means that we're probably going to be physical centric, that means that our Blasphemy would be Vulnerability. Vulnerability increases the chance that the enemy would be inflicted with bleed anyhow, so it's synergizing with our build there, but also increases the physical damage that the enemy takes. So all around, that's what we would want there. Whereas, if we looked at something like, say, Smite, a Smite character would want probably Conductivity. Most of your damage is going to be concentrated into lightning, and as such, utilizing Conductivity would more than likely be the best benefit of your damage. And then, again, looking at something like Infernal Blow, which is similar to Smite, except take out lightning, add fire, we'd probably want Flammability there. Now, all this considered, we can also contemplate something even generic, like a Warlord's Mark even, to just give us additional chance to stun enemies, which helps kind of keep us going, and Leech. But that is something that that's the bridge we cross later once we have more things of the build kind of in place. So, with 35% auras, we're left with 30% of our mana. This gives us 2 options. First option is, actually it gives us 3 options. First option is an Essence Worm with a 50% aura, be it Haste, one of the damage auras, Grace, Armor, Determination. Whether it's one of them or whether it's a damage aura, if we run the setup with an Essence Worm, we could squeeze in a 50% aura, easy peasy, and then, if I'm not mistaken, it should increase the mana reservation enough to where we can fit 2 exactly. Yeah. Yep. 35s look like they become 50s. So, at that point, all of a sudden, I believe, if I remember correctly, they become 49. And that would mean that our Blasphemy would reserve 49% mana. Our Vitality would reserve 49% mana, and we'd be left with 2% mana. But again, we're using a Soul Taker, so guess what? We don't actually give a shit. Mana isn't a concern for us unless we wanted to splash in something like an Orb of Storms for Elemental Equilibrium, or maybe like a Phase Run or a Flame Dash, but something like Flame Dash we can already get in Leap Slam, and that's an attack, so that will work with Soul Taker. And then Phase Run we can kind of just shield charge through minions anyways, so we can also or we can just Leap Slam over them, so we don't need to worry about that either. So this is all like things that we can think about going forward. Or our other options are get a third 35% aura, and then that will require that we run at least an Enlighten, or we pick up some aura nodes on tree in order to take that 105% mana reservation and dip it just under the 100 mark. Again, it's a Soul Taker. We want every little bit of our mana reserved if we can help it. So that's our second option. Our third option is picking something that costs 25% mana. This will give us a grand total of 95% mana reserved, and this means more than likely a Herald. Honestly, I think Arctic Armor is a little bit booty. You have to stand still to actually get it. We don't really want to be standing still. But, granted, if we're on like a build like Infernal Blow, where unless it's something that's liable to one-shot you, you kind of do want to stand still, we could maybe entertain the idea of Arctic Armor. All things considered, though, at that point, we're probably looking at a Herald that synergizes with our build. So if we're Smite, we might grab Herald of Thunder, or probably Herald of Purity. If we are Fizz-based, we probably grab the Herald of Purity. If we are Fire-based, we can grab the Herald of Ash to spread the overkill damage as a burn. That can give us a little bit of extra clear. So these are all things that we're going to think about for later. Now, again, we mentioned that we're going to be a recovery and regeneration-centric part of the build. And actually, I noticed that KC is oddly missing today. I'm going to go ahead and PM him on Discord and see if they want to actually hop in here. Again, we'll have this highlighted anyways. But, so, back to the build. We are going to be recovery and regen centric. Now, there's a reason why I kind of actually said both of those. So, we're going to start with the regen because that's the easier part. So we're going to come over to our tree here. Now, we want regen, so we obviously want life. And then we want to try to get all of the regen that we can. So we have regen here. If we go ahead and look at life regen, we can kind of see where we want to go. So we would like to get to Shaper and grab this. This might be a little bit far out of the way. This is kind of the big ticket right here. And that's the endurance charges. Since we're going to be building endurance charges anyways, we're going to go ahead and grab these endurance charges, and now we need to get down here. We might be better off going this way, grabbing this. We're going to be going probably sword and boards, but these nodes are kind of shit, so we'll actually come down this way. Get to Golem's Blood. So it's a very baseline-like idea for the build. We can actually even come up here. Get this regen and this life. So as a very brief, quick, throw the very basics down onto the build. We've got this. So, we have pretty much every life regen node that we can get in our area. Arsonist has life regen on it, but it's fire damage, so I don't really think that 4 points for 1% life regen is enough if we end up not fire. If we do end up on a fire build, chances are Arsonist might actually not be too bad. The other options we have to think about are quick recovery, on these 3 nodes here. Now these 3 nodes are the kind of thing that, like, if we're really deep into our build, we're over level 90 and we're just looking for like little bits that we could pick up, this might not be that bad of an idea. But as Theorycraft right now, we wouldn't actually grab this. So right there, that's a pretty good way to start. Oh, that's a 2-point jewel socket. And this even opens up some potential route changing. We could go here and grab these 3 nodes, connect these 2 arcs, and then because Born to Fight is like alright but not great, and we have 2 nodes here, we could possibly like chop this section off and we'd still be connected as an overall, but we'll worry about that later. Alright, so we've got all of the regen kind of set up. We've got all of the good life nodes. So you see the only extra life node I grabbed was this because it's 6%. It's technically slightly above rate. Now, the recovery part. And this is where things are going to get a little bit stupid. So, there is... We're a Juggernaut, alright? We've already kind of covered that. And Juggernauts play well with endurance charges. So, we're going to go to endurance charge. We're going to go see what we can do with endurance charges. And we're going to see both of our things that we're going to use in this build. So, the first thing I've had in mind comes ways. Extra endurance charge. Regen per endurance charge. These sound like exactly what we want in our build. So, we're going to go ahead and switch back to this. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to take Helm's Weight. It's a ring, so we're going to add 2 of them to the build. Now, what's notable is that earlier we discussed the whole use an Essence Worm to get a 50% damage aura, and that will make our 235s effectively reserve like 98% of our mana. Well, now that Essence Worm strategy comes at the cost of a Helm's Way. And there, I'm not necessarily convinced that that would actually be worth it. So, we could pretty much take that idea regarding our mana reservation and throw it out the window now, as it's a better chance that our Helm's Ways are going to be more relevant to us than something like the Essence Worm strategy. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to come back over to here, and let's continue. Alright, so we could run a Death's Door to gain an extra endurance charge. Now, all things considered, these boots are pretty good. And the bleed immunity is nice. They have a little bit of all res and decent movement speed. We can use these, but if we go over to PoE Ninja, we see that right now, Death's Doors are 2.5x. It's a little bit of a steep price. With Incursion League, when they reworked all of the corruptions, boots can now roll an implicit endurance charge. So what this means is that we can think about other unique boots that are easier to get corruptions on, and using a +1 endurance charge there. And for that, we're going to think about Kelm's Roots. We're not really a super move speed, go fast kind of build. So we're going to go maximum endurance charges implicit. And we see that these start at like 1x, 1.5x. And the big thing here is that we're also getting a pair of boots that have the you cannot be slowed below base speed. Remember what I mentioned about this inside of our Ascendancy class earlier? And that it actually is a pretty good utility option to have? Well, this is why we are going to think about not actually taking that node, because we're actually going to pick it up somewhere else. Unwavering Stance. This is a passive node on the tree that says we cannot evade attacks, but we also cannot be stunned. Well, cannot be stunned actually also is part of that Ascendancy node that had the you cannot be slowed below base speed. So how convenient. We're actually going to get basically half of that Ascendancy node, at least, for free. And just like I mentioned with the Ascendancy node, these boots are going to effectively also give us freeze immunity, because you cannot be slowed below base speed prevents freeze. Cannot be knocked back. Cool, that's an extra bonus. No sockets. Alright, that's a little bit of a downside, but we can work around it. And then a shit ton of maximum life. And that's really a big selling point. We want this build to just be big, beefy, getting a shit ton of healing, and life regen is percent based for the most part. So that means the more life we have, the more life we regen, and the better chances that we can kind of sustain through the darkness. So this is going to be the kind of thing that we want to look for. And we can see that the life roll kind of varies. And this guy's probably a little bit overpriced, but we're going to be able to get like a 2x item. And this is a pretty good item for our build, so that's actually kind of reasonable. So we're going to come over here, and we're going to go ahead and put Kelm's Roots in. And we're going to corrupt these for +1 to maximum endurance charges. Boom. Alright, so suddenly, this build gets 10 endurance charges. 10. 3 baseline, 3 from the tree, 1 from Juggernaut, 1 from each of our rings, and 1 from our boots. So we're going to go ahead and turn on endurance charges. Now, all these endurance charges are going to give us a bunch of physical mitigation, a bunch of elemental resistances. If we're at maximum, we get more reduced elemental damage taken. We get chaos resistance per charge. And even more, because of this node right here, we're actually going to get life regen per endurance charge. So that means we will have up to a maximum of 2% life regen per second because of our endurance charges. So added on top of all the other regen we have, it's just going to be more regeneration to get through that darkness. Now we're going to go back to the wiki page and continue with endurance charges. So, endurance charge duration here, we have 2 items noted. But Kingsguard, we're going to go down right now. So Kingsguard here, as we can see, gives us a reasonable life roll, some mana, not that we really honestly care about that, 30% increased endurance charge generation. That means our endurance charges are going to last a really, really long time. And then that last line there, gain 100 life when an endurance charge is expiring, or when it expires, or when it is consumed. Well, we have 10 endurance charges. So, if we can exploit this, or utilize it very, very repetitively, then we can get quite the life recovery. And what's notable about this is that the Juggernaut node that gives you the +1 endurance charge also happens to feature a couple different notable passives that we're going to mention now. So, we have a 30% chance to gain an endurance charge when we take a hit. That's fine. Chances are, especially in the darkness, because there's so many enemies that are back there, we're going to take some hits. And that means that we're going to have chances to gain an endurance charge. Then, on top of that, we have a 25% chance that if we gain an endurance charge, we instead go directly up to our maximum. So this means that if we have no charges, we have a 30% chance when we take a hit to gain 1 charge. Then, because we gained a charge, we have a 25% chance for that 1 charge to instead be 10. Right away. Next line. Gain an endurance charge every second if you've been hit recently. So, even though we have a 30% chance to gain endurance charge when we get hit, we additionally will, if we've been hit, recently being the past 4 seconds, then every second for the past 4 seconds we gain an endurance charge. Then, that line above also comes into play. So let's say we take a hit, the 30% doesn't roll. Now we're ticking, first second we get an endurance charge. 25% chance to go to 10. It doesn't happen. Get an endurance charge the next second. Oh, 25% chance hit. Now we have 10 endurance charges all of a sudden. Boom. This is going to be constant generation of our charges. So this means we're going to be, our generation is probably not going to be the issue. So, regarding Kingsguard, because we need our charges to either expire, which they're never going to because of how frequently we're going to generate them, or we need to consume them. And it's that second part that we're going to touch on. How can we consume endurance charges? There are two big things, and we're going to utilize both of them in the build. The first is a skill gem that most players will probably be familiar with, and that's Immortal Call. So we go ahead and kick this open. And we're going to bring up Immortal Call. So Immortal Call is a spell that burns all of your endurance charges and gives you a base 0.4 second invulnerability period where you cannot take physical damage. That period is then scaled by a percentage based on gem level for every endurance charge that Immortal Call spends. So what this means is that if we have maximum endurance charges, 10, and we have a level 20 Immortal Call, and we get hit, so we have that base 0.4 second period, and then we have 1570 increased buff duration because we had 10 endurance charges. Alright, so how do we want to go about using Immortal Call? Well, it doesn't look like Immortal Call got the quality of life of becoming an instant cast, so we can't just knee-jerk it by pressing the button. Well, conveniently, we can do what everybody has basically always done with Immortal Call, and that's cast when damage taken. Now, the big thing with cast when damage taken is that the amount of damage required to trigger your gem kind of scales very, very hard. So we're going to want to find kind of a nice little niche, a nice nook in this math, where it doesn't take too long to trigger Immortal Call, but we're not triggering it too quickly either. Because if we trigger it too quickly, we're just kind of burning through our endurance charges. We're not getting long Immortal Calls from all of our endurance charges going into it. And we're also not spending as much as quickly regarding the Kingsguard. Hey, Telenius, how are you doing? Welcome to To Theorycraft. You have missed about a little under half an hour. We haven't covered too much. I can give you a very quick TLDR. Additionally, this will be highlighted and saved, and I will have a link for it, so anybody will be able to get back to it later. But basically, to catch you up to speed real quick, I mentioned that when you go into your character creation, if you're theory crafting, you want to know what your character wants to do. Now, the more in-depth explanation of that, I'll let you catch that up if you check the highlight later. But basically, regarding character focus, this is going to be a character that is designed to walk through the darkness with absolute ignorance via regen and recovery mechanics. Now, we have decided that we are going to go with Juggernaut because we can get all this endurance charge tankiness, regen here. We're not crit, so we don't care about undeniable. We have access to most of unstoppable in another spot, and then in yielding is going to be some nice quality of life. I have life regen searched in the tree. You can see that we have pretty much most of the notable life regen nodes in our area, including the one that scales off of our endurance charges. Then we're going to go to our items. We've got Calm's Roots with +1 endurance charge, and 2 Calm's Ways that give us an endurance charge and regen per endurance charge. This gives us a grand total of 1% of our maximum life regenerated per endurance charge between the pair of rings and the tree node that we have. We're going to be using a Soul Taker so that we can reserve as much of our mana as humanly possible and then still be able to attack. Also, Soul Taker is a reasonably good priced weapon that has, honestly, very competitive stats for endgame one-handers. We're going to be using a Blasphemy. What curse is unknown yet is we don't actually know what we're going to attack with. That's kind of the last part of the puzzle that we're going to put together. And then we're going to use Vitality. Vitality, honestly, a little bit of an underwhelming aura, all things considered, but it's regen, and that's what we want. Now, as we were going down our Endurance Charge Synergy, we came across Kingsguard. We'll worry about that later, Mark. This is a build that I'm not, this isn't a build I'm building on a budget. This is a build that is I wanted to do something, and I don't care what the price is going to be. It needs to do that something. We found Kingsguard. Now, it's got some nice life roll. It's got some armor. That's great, too. Mana we don't care about because, as I mentioned before, we have a Soul Taker. Increased endurance charge duration is nice. It's not really going to matter because we're going to have so much generation because of being a Juggernaut that it won't really affect us. But it's that last line. Gain 100 life when an endurance charge expires or is consumed. Now, because of everything in our build, chances are they're never going to expire, so we need to consume them. Our first option, cast when damage taken, Immortal Call. Immortal Call's physical immunity period scales based on how many endurance charges it gets to eat when it triggers, or when you cast it. Now, because it's not instant speed cast, it has almost a 1 second cast time, we don't actually want to self-cast it. So, we're going to couple it with cast when damage taken, and we're going to find a kind of nice middle ground where it's not going to trigger too often, where we might get triggers where we might get periods where we're not triggering it because we're taking too much damage too quickly, but we also don't want it taking too long to trigger, as that could put us into a situation where we could die. So we're going to probably be somewhere between levels 7 to 13 most likely. We'll do some math later to try to figure out where that gravy zone is. And the reason we want to find a nice middle point is that it will also allow us to level up our Immortal Call. And as we just covered right before you got here, the more that we can level Immortal Call, the longer that invulnerability period is going to last, because it scales with level of the gem per endurance charge. So the higher we can level this Immortal Call, the longer that physical immunity period is going to last. Physical immunity is going to allow our regen to do more work. Also, when Immortal Call triggers, it's going to eat up all of our endurance charges really quickly, and coupled with Kingsguard, give us X amount of life back immediately, where X is equal to the number of endurance charges times 100. So if we happen to be at 10 endurance charges when Immortal Call triggers, not only are we going to get a pretty nice, beefy period of invulnerability, but we're also going to instantaneously gain back 1,000 life thanks to Kingsguard. Now, earlier, right before you got here, I mentioned that there are 2 things that we're going to do to abuse that Kingsguard. And the second one, the first one being Immortal Call, the second one involves an item I found on stream yesterday. And if any of you recall what my reaction was when I identified and looked at this item, I went, this is abusable, and I'm going to do something with it. I like the looks of it. This has something to do. And that is the Eternal Apple. So this is a shield that was added this patch with Delve. And what's notable here is that, well, honestly, just about every line of text on this item is pretty good. Trigger a socketed Warcry skill when you lose endurance charges. So, when our Immortal Call triggers, this shield will immediately trigger a Warcry that we have socketed in it. Awesome. 60 to 80 max life. Cool. Good life roll. Chaos Res. Sweet. I'm never going to turn down Chaos Res. You lose all endurance charges at maximum endurance charges. Well then, this means the second we hit 10 endurance charges, the shield will burn them all. Now, that's going to trigger our King's Guard and give us a bunch of flat life recovery immediately. It's also going to trigger our Socketed Warcry skill. And we can't block, sure, we don't really care. We're a Juggernaut, we kind of want to take hits anyways. And then 50% increased Warcry cooldown recovery speed. So that means that will help whatever is socketed in here be available to trigger more often. Now, what Warcry are we going to put in here? Well, that is where we're going to be looking for a little bit more abuse out of this build. And my plan is going to be to take the Eternal Apple and put Enduring Cry in here. And for those of you who do not know, Enduring Cry is a Warcry that will give you endurance charges based on how many enemies are in the area of effect, and then additionally will give you a very short duration flat life regen increase. So you see here at gem level 20, we would get 0.75 seconds of 394 life regenerated per second. Well, not quite. Because we are going to interact so much with this Warcry, we're going to be taking these Warcry nodes right here and right here. Now, how we're going to route to this one is a little bit different. I'm not sure yet. More than likely, we might just go point efficiency here. So the Warcry nodes are going to give us some cooldown recovery speed. Warcry buff, this means more regen. Warcry duration means more regen. You and nearby allies have attack, cast, and movement speed if you've Warcried recently. So that means that when the Warcry happens, we're going to get a 6% attack, cast, and move speed for 4 seconds. Excuse me. Cool. Quality of life. Duration, recovery speed, and then more recovery speed, more buff effect, and our Warcries are instant. Alright, so with all this Warcry synergy, we're going to then have our Enduring Cry in our shield. Now, because of the way cooldown recovery speed works, and we're going to end up with a grand total of 80% increased cooldown recovery speed, effectively at 100% cooldown recovery speed, our cooldown would be half the duration. So instead of 4 seconds, it would be 2. So we're going to be a little bit north of 2, probably something like 2.3, 2.4 seconds. So every 2.3 to 2.4 seconds, our Warcry in our shield will be able to trigger. Now, it gives us endurance charges. This means that we're going to immediately gain a bunch of endurance charges, which our shield is immediately going to void. This is going to mean that we're going to have our shield kind of give us a rhythm of a cycle. We'll run out, we'll lose our endurance charges, and then our shield will immediately give us our endurance charges back. Nice. Awesome. That's exactly what we want. Because all of this cycling is going to feed back into the King's Guard. Because every time these endurance charges go away, we're going to get more and more and more life back from it. And it doesn't look... Now, this is a... Oh, it is actually... Oh. This is actually old wording. We click here and we actually see that it says when you lose an endurance charge. So this wording clarifies the only concern I had, and that would be if the lose endurance charge from the shield would actually screw up Kingsguard. Now we're going to come over here real quick and we're going to just double check that the ones on the market have this fancy wording. Oh look, they do in fact say when you lose an endurance charge. So that basically confirms that the interaction from the Apple and Kingsguard will 100% function. That's great. So now we're going to go back to Path of Building. And now we have 2 more items to plug into our build. We have Kingsguard and the Eternal Apple. Alright, so this leaves us with 4 slots, a bunch of flasks, and a bunch of jewels. Alright, so the next thing we're going to kind of now start to think about is what are we going to do damage with? Because all we know is that we've got a Soul Taker. We've got a pretty good axe here, but what's the end game? Like, what are we actually hitting enemies with? Now, we're only level 59 required because we haven't taken any damage nodes on the tree. So this is where we're going to start to pick up damage nodes. Now, the first thing is our routing has plopped us right in front of the axe nodes. Both of these are going to be basically applicable to any attack skill that we're going to use. And the reason for that is, let's say we do use something like Smite or Infernal Blow that converts part of the physical to an elemental damage type. Well, the physical will scale before the conversion, so these nodes are still going to have value. Now on top of that, this gives us a bunch of attack speed and physical damage with axes, along with a chance to gain onslaught on kill. That's quality of life you don't want to really turn down. And then here we've got a bunch more damage and a overall 25% chance to cause bleeding. As I mentioned before, what are we going to kill with? We don't know whether it's Smite, Double Strike, Lacerate. With these questions unanswered, something like this is pretty nifty, because that chance to bleed, well, what if we are a Lacerate or a Double Strike build? Both of these skills deal more damage against bleeding enemies. So this is just going to end up turning into better synergy with our build if we do end up that route. So, if we elect to focus more specifically on being, if you will, a axe-oriented character and worrying a little bit less about the what of our damage type and more of the fact that we're using an axe, what we can do here is start to look at these nodes. So Splitting Strikes is actually a really good node. And then Hatchet Master is actually an insane node too. So we can pass through this 5% life node and come down here. And what this is also going to do is we can drop the Jewel Socket here from Strength and grab it with Dex. As right now we can see that 104 Dex and 422 Strength, we'd probably rather get that Dex if need be, because for all we know, our support gems are maybe going to need a little bit more Dex than we currently have in our build. This also means that we can now take a Mana and Life Leech node. Now, whether we're going to take more than this one node or not, we'll kind of cross that bridge later. But for now, that node is pretty point efficient, and we're at level 80. We've grabbed a bunch more damage, a bunch more attack speed that's all kind of synergistic with our build. So now we're going to look at kind of our starting area, and I hinted at this earlier. We can take these 3 nodes here and cut these 4. Now, we lose a little bit of melee physical damage and some attack speed, a little bit of life, but that life just got rerouted here, and we saved 1 point. All in all, not too bad. Now, we've got Berserking here. This is a pretty damn good node for getting a lot of damage out quickly. Or we could focus on our life. And right now, I want to focus more on our life because we just want this build to be more tanky and we'll kill the enemy. You know, it's gonna die eventually, you know. If we're a little bit slower, but the build does exactly what we want, which is just march into the darkness completely ignorantly and be able to clear shit along the way, great. We're not exactly building this build to go kill Shaper. We don't need bullshit levels of damage. If we get a few 100,000 DPS, chances are that's going to feel good enough. So we'll look at where we can grab life. So we've got this entire section of the tree that's open. We can try to figure out what we want to do with this Warcry node. It's a little awkward positionally. And if we go this way, we can grab the Bloodless. So that's actually what we're going to do. We're going to go grab Bloodless, and we're going to drop these travel nodes that are a little less substantial to us. Now we're at level 84. Now we can either do one of 2 things. Come up here to get Purity of Flesh, get us extra Chaos Resistance, or dump into the Scion Life Wheel. Scion Life Wheel will be technically more efficient as far as raw life is concerned. And we're 84, so this alone would put us to 91. 93 when we grab this jewel socket, which we probably would want to grab. Now, people who have been in chat with me have known me to be an advocate of making sure that your builds are a pretty reasonable level to attain. 93 is maybe a little bit higher for my taste, and we're going to look at this right here. So right here, we're paying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points for a jewel socket and 1.7% life regen. I'd rather use that 5 points to just get more life. Now, that same 93 looks a little bit better because we have 212% increased maximum life. And we're going to have better resistances thanks to the chaos resistance from this. We lose a little bit of regen, but chances are with everything else in our build, we're not going to really need to sweat that. And at 93, I would like to trim nodes down here a little bit, but I'm willing to kind of accept a level 93 tree as a good completion point. It could honestly be that this is actually overkill, and that we could take these nodes and just grab Berserking. Actually, I think that's probably the better option. We'll grab Berserking, and then we could grab other nodes along the way. Maybe we do go to Born the Fight. Maybe we come over to Strong Arm. If we do that, we could look at rerouting again, maybe save another point or two there. Never ever think that your build that you theorycraft, that whatever passive tree you come down to at the end is complete. Anybody who's kept up with me from the beginning of this league will know exactly what I'm talking about. I have taken a caustic arrow build that came from here and went down and up and all the way to Mind Over Matter, and I first trimmed all of Mind Over Matter, and then I came down here and got some Toxic Strikes and some Thick Skin for some extra utility, and then I also got over to Herbalism. I later respec'd out of that chunk and then opted to go instead for Phase Acrobatics and Fatal Toxins. Never ever accept that your tree is final or that it is ever in the best form, because until you get this character to maps or to delves or to the boss that you want to farm, you won't know if it is actually truly complete. You might want to trim a little bit of life because you feel like you're maybe more tanky than you need to be, and you'd like to pick up some damage to make your clear a little bit more efficient. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe you're already clearing really, really well, but you're taking a couple little heart palpitations here and there from your life dipping dangerously low when you weren't expecting it to. Always be ready and willing to drop some points here and take points elsewhere, because the only way you're going to know what your tree needs is to invest the time in game to actually get that experience and find out, I need to be more tanky, or I'm too tanky and I need to clear faster. I'm struggling with getting resistances on my gear. Maybe the 2 points to get the Diamond Skin or the 2 points to get the Sentinel are suddenly worth it to help ease up my gearing. Because while I've planned to have, these items like a 6-link Kingsguard and Calm's Roots that are corrupted with an endurance charge that are going to cost me maybe 2 exalts, maybe I need that ability to save a little bit to get everything all together all at the same time on like my belt or my amulet or something like that. You're always going to be iterating through different ideas as you progress through your build. So never, ever, ever lock yourself into a train of thought that what you theory crafted in Path of Building is what you're going to always end up on later on in maps. What we theory craft here is all practice. It's all great. You want to see damage numbers that you think are going to be comfortable, and you want to see survivability numbers that you're pretty sure is going to get you not killed pretty much ever. But until you are actually experiencing the game with the character, you can't know for sure that what you planned will actually accomplish the goal that you set out for. So with that being said, we've kind of gotten our tree roughly finalized for now. You know, we can move points around, but it won't really do anything. Like, we take this, drop that, doesn't really do anything. We take this, drop that, we kind of actually want int, so we don't want to do that either. Especially because we need 118 int for this shield. So, the next part moving forward is going to be more of the what's of the build. And the main what's that we're going to have, so we're going to first off figure out our shield. So our shield is going to be Enduring Cry. And then what do we want to pair Enduring Cry with? Well, chances are we want it to last longer, so we'll pair it with Increased Duration at the bare minimum. Now we have a third slot in our option. So we're gonna toy with some stuff. So we see that we get area of effect for qualities. So portal and enhance together, since the enhance would give the portal cast speed, which would be nice, and then would give enduring cry quality, but it's only area of effect, so that's it's not really too great. So we're gonna kind of pass on that one. So we're gonna hit new, and we're gonna see, like, all right, well, what could we do? We have heralds, so we're gonna fit in at some point, and then we don't really know, like, what other auras we want. But you know what we're gonna probably be able to settle on? We want a totem, and we want one of the ancestral totems, be it War Chief or Protector. Now, if you are the killer and you're looking for the totem's buff to be more benefit to you, 9 times out of 10, Ancestral Protector is the better one. So here we're going to have 3 sockets in our shield, and that will give us the War Cry that we need, along with increased duration to make the War Cry's buff longer, and then also increased duration making our totem last longer when it's on the field. So hopefully we don't have to put it down as often in a prolonged engagement. And we're going to put this in our shield. Great. We're also level... we're 88 because we cut this. And we added Berserking, so even better. We'll just say we're level 88. So we're going to set our level to 88 so that we can see what our life and mana and regen and stuff like that are going to be. Now we have Vitality. We already know that that's solid. This is going to be our curse set up. Now, we don't know what curse we're going to use yet, and I hinted at that earlier because we don't know what skill we're going to use yet. Now, we do need a cast when damage taken setup, so we're going to have cast when damage taken, Immortal Call, increased duration, and then this last slot is going to be open. This will probably be a golem of some variety, depending on whether we want Flame Golem for damage or Stone Golem for more regen. Maybe we want Lightning Golem for more attack speed. We don't know yet. But what we do know is that the numbers here are going to be played with a little bit. We don't know exactly how long we want our Immortal Call, or rather, we don't know what level we want our cast when damage taken to better use with our Immortal Call. Then we've got this. This is going to go in, let's say, our helmet. This is in our shield. Vitality and our curse are probably going to be in another slot. And that's going to leave weapon, which is going to be shield charge. Faster attacks. Fortify, as we want to take as little damage as possible. This will probably be in our weapon, as our weapon is pretty good with the colors. And then we're going to have our damage skill, and our damage skill has to be 6-link, so it's going to be in our chest piece. Our boots don't have any sockets because we're using Calms. This means that right now, our last 4-link that we know of, since we already have the Immortal Call set up as 1 4-link, we have an empty 4-link, and our third 4-link unfortunately doesn't actually have sockets. And our 2 3-links are the Warcry set up with our totem, and then our shield charge setup. This means that the last 4 link has to be our auras. So Vitality, Blasphemy, whatever curse we select, and then whatever else we put in there, which will more than likely be whatever reserves the remainder of our mana. More than likely, some form of Herald. So at this point, we now are going to settle down and figure out the what of the build. What are we going to smash monsters with? Now, to begin with, I have a few options. Val Double Strike is very, very good. We're going to have a bunch of these that we're going to have to figure out what's better. Lacerate is great. Smite is wonderful right now. I've heard Consecrated Path is pretty good, so why not? We'll check that. Infernal Blow is pretty good to get pretty nice coverage with. Could even throw in Sunder, but I think all of this would actually outperform Sunder right now. So I'm not really willing to worry about Sunder. Hell, why not? Could theoretically throw in Lightning Strike if we wanted to. That's an option that we could go. So what we're basically going to do now is figure out what our 6 links would be so that we can kind of analyze. I guess we should theoretically add this bastard in too, because it's always pretty good on the damage. So we're going to take this, and we have 7 skills. And now what we're going to do is we're going to figure out which of these we want more. So what we can definitely confirm is that with something like Double Strike or Lacerate, this is going to need to be Vulnerability. With something like Molten Strike or Infernal Blow, this is going to need to be Flammability. And then with something like Lightning Strike or Smite, we're going to want Conductivity. Regarding Consecrated Path, I'm actually going to go to the wiki and figure out what the fuck it actually does, because I haven't really looked at it. Alright, so this is fire, so it's going to want Flammability. The nice kind of nifty idea with Consecrated Path is that it drops Consecrated Ground around. And when you're standing on Consecrated Ground, you regenerate 6% of your life per second. Well, what's the entire focus of our build? Regen and recovery. Having access to Consecrated Ground for free is pretty nice. Granted, we can just carry a Sulphur Flask to drop it at our feet when we need it, and Sulphur Flasks also give us a damage increase anyhow, so whether we actually need Consecrated Path per se or not, we don't know yet. We'll kind of come to that later. I haven't really played around with Con's Path yet, but it's good to note that it can't be supported by multi-strike so that I don't forget that. So, obviously we're not running 3 curses here, but for right now, well, no, we're not actually. I was going to say we're going to leave all 3 checked, but that's actually bad. And the reason being is that a lot of our skills deal like 60% fizz converted to an element, but the rest of that fizz would benefit from vulnerability. So what we're going to have to do is, as we go down and figure out our gem setups for every skill individually, we're going to actually have to go up to our curse setup and check or uncheck each curse depending on what skill we're working with. So we're just going to go straight down the list. Our first setup is Double Strike. And as we discussed before, we 100% want vulnerability for Double Strike. Now, one other thing, if we're going to be Double Strike or Lacerate, because we're bleed based, we're going to 1000% be using Hemophilias. Not only do they give you damage over time, which helps your bleed damage, but also give you a chance to bleed, making your build more consistent, and also attack damage against bleeding enemies, sure, more damage, and then that other thing. Bleeding enemies you kill, explode, dealing 5% of their maximum life as physical damage. This is really good. Skills like Double Strike lack a little bit when it comes to AoE. Now, something like this means that we can maybe just use something as simple as just Ancestral Call or just Melee Splash to kind of give us a little bit of coverage. And then, because we're going to be bleeding these enemies, as soon as the first one dies, boom, the pack is going to explode. So, while we're working with the 2 bleed builds, we're going to add hemophilia to the build. Additionally, because these are bleed-oriented builds, we're going to go into our configuration, and we're going to make sure that we check, is the enemy bleeding? Because our intention is to always make the enemy bleed. And if we come over to our calculations, and we look at just double strike on its own, now, with everything, we have a 70% chance to inflict bleed. And that is 25 from hemophilia, 25 from our nodes, and I believe vulnerability is 20. Gonna double check that to be sure. 20% chance to bleed when hit by attacks. Wonderful. So what this means is that we now have a 70% chance to bleed. All things considered, that's a pretty respectable amount to be at to enforce consistency into your build. With something like Double Strike, where, let's go back to the wiki real quick, and let's look at Double Strike. Double Strike gets a huge amount of physical damage against bleeding enemies. So, you want this damage as consistently as possible. Look at something like Lacerate. Same exact thing. 25% more damage with hits and ailments against bleeding enemies. So if you can consistently make sure that within the first couple hits of your build, attacking into a pack, the enemies are now bleeding, you're going to get access to all these juicy more damage or all this juicy flat added damage that Double Strike or Lacerate have. And that means more damage for your build to capitalize on. 70% is pretty consistent, all things considered. And when we come back to our tree, we're not that far from Red Storm. And Red Storm would give us another 25%, along with some global physical damage, which would affect most of our builds. Now, if we end up on a bleed build, chances are Red Storm's not going to be too bad. If we end up on one of those elemental builds, well, look at this. We're right next to Holy Dominion and Divine Fervor, or even something like Celestial Judgment. So our generic tree that kind of will serve our purpose no matter what skill we're using has the ability, now that we're level 88, to spend 4 points to get Red Storm if we're a bleed build, or, maybe spend 3 points to get both Holy Dominion and Divine Fervor, or 3 points for Celestial Judgment, and get a little bit of extra damage, but that will be more build specific, so we'd rather settle on what we're attacking with first, rather than worry about all of these nodes. And then if the generic scaling, when we look at all of the skills comparative with our generic tree, if there's clear outliers that are just miles above the others, well, we should obviously think about picking them instead, since we are a tank first, damage second build, and in that case, we definitely want to try to pick the best damage that we can get for our build as is, skill-wise, to end up not running into a situation where our build feels clunky later on because we just don't quite have enough damage. So, we've checked bleeding. Always make sure if you're trying to factor something that wants the enemies to be bleeding, make sure to check this box. Likewise, if you wanted your enemy to be burning for, say, something like Immolate support, or if you wanted them to be chilled or frozen for, say, Hypothermia, then you would want to check these boxes. Now, one thing I'm going to note is that since we're going to be doing physical damage no matter what, I'm going to check the chilled box. And the reason for that is Soul Taker. Soul Taker has the unique modifier on it, your physical damage can chill. Now, the reason that this is relevant, as I just mentioned, Hypothermia, I'm going to come here to look at Hypothermia. Hypothermia deals more damage with hits and ailments against chilled enemies. It doesn't specify a damage type. It is a generic more multiplier, which means that it will give us more damage of every type that we inflict, along with giving us a chance to freeze enemies that are chilled. So, this can often, when combined with Soul Taker, mean that Hypothermia is actually a better support in like the 5th or 6th slot of your 6th link when you actually look at everything kind of factored all together. So with that, let's actually start with Val Double Strike. So we've come up here and we've enabled vulnerability as we're going to be a physical oriented bleed build. So now we're going to look at Double Strike. And to see how gems are going to affect your DPS, they need to be active in the main skill slot on the left over here. So we're going to come down to Val Double Strike. Now, we're going to actually look at Double Strike and not Val Double Strike. And that's because we mostly want to focus on our damage and not the damage from the clones that we summon. The big thing that we are going to note here is that Double Strike can be supported by Multi-Strike. Val Double Strike cannot. So, in the event that we do want something to help us attack faster, we might actually want to take faster attacks instead of multi-strike, since faster attacks would also give our clones more damage when we are fighting those tankier enemies that we do want to have the extra damage up for. So, we click this. Oh, hey, I forgot one note on the tree. Yeah, we're a Resolute Technique build. First thing I saw was additional accuracy, and I know I fucked up and forgot to click RT. Yeah, so no matter what we're going to do, we're going to be a Resolute Technique build, so that way we don't worry about crit. Crit makes your build cost more, and even worse when we have all this weird stuff synergizing with endurance charges. We just want to fucking hit all the time. So, with that now, Brutality. Brutality is a skill that means that we will only inflict physical damage, but it is one of the fattest more multipliers in the game. Now, this is interesting for a couple reasons. As is, we can look at potentially flasks like at Ziri's Promise, Taste of Hate, or Sin's Rebirth to give us additional damage of other elements. That also being said, we haven't decided what Herald we're going to use yet. So what if we want Herald of Ash to give us more damage and that fire spread to help us with that AoE clear? So something like Brutality can often be a little bit of a trap, and as such, I'm going to actually ignore it. So we're going to go melee physical, kind of expect that as we are a melee phys build. Bloodlust. This is another trap. If you check, is the enemy bleeding, to enable the flat damage from Val Double Strike, Bloodlust is going to show up. But the thing with Bloodlust is it gives you a lot of extra more damage against bleeding enemies, but it takes away the ability for that skill to inflict bleeding. And that ultimately is going to be a non-bow with us, as we do want our attack skill to be able to inflict that bleed. We don't want to have to rely on a secondary attack skill to cause the bleed so that our primary attack skill does more damage. This just kind of gets to be too clunky. Endurance Charge on melee stun. I would be tempted to pick this, but there is one factor that we aren't sure about with our build, and that's where our endurance charges are going to rest. Because we're electing to go for this option with the synergy between Kingsguard and the Warcry shield that immediately deletes our endurance charges the second they hit 10, the reason that this is so high is because the path of building is right now factoring us always being at full 10 endurance charges. Now, we don't know if that's always going to be the case. We don't know whether we're going to always fluctuate in like 7, 8, 9. We don't know what percentage of the time we're at what endurance charges. So we're going to ignore endurance charge on melee stun. If we weren't using that shield, but we were still using all the other endurance charge synergy, and then maybe perhaps we do actually drop that shield later because it ends up being too clunky, and we just want to use enduring or immortal call to burn our endurance charges to get us life back for Kingsguard and get us those huge periods of invulnerability. At that point, endurance charge on melee stun might look really good because more often than not, we're spending our time at 10 charges, and that means that it is going to give us a big more multiplier to our damage. We come down to our next one, and look what's here. Hypothermia. As I mentioned before, because of the synergy with Soul Taker, and Soul Taker is the axe that we really do actually want to use in this build, suddenly hypothermia is looking like a good more multiplier more percentage of the time. So we're going to go ahead and add that in. Now we see Ruthless. Ruthless is another one that I don't like. Because it really is only a big more multiplier every third hit. This does factor those third hits in, but, you know, what if you want to delete a pack in 1 or 2 hits and not 3? Then Ruthless, or you know, what if our damage is good enough that we are deleting packs in 1 or 2 hits? Then Ruthless is really only there for bosses, and if that's what we wanted, then we would maybe use it in like a gem swap setup where we carry around the level 20, like 20 quality Ruthless with us in our inventory, and when we do get to a boss, we swap it out for something like maybe Melee Splash. So we're going to ignore that. Now we come to Multi-Strike. Now, this is where we're going to get to that discussion I talked to earlier, and the only reason that we're going to have this discussion is because we're on Double Strike right now. Every future skill, if it says Multi-Strike, we're probably going to take Multi-Strike. So, Multi-Strike gives us plus 3.03 attack rate. That is a 94% increase to our attack speed, and gives us an overall net gain of total DPS of 36%. That's pretty sweet. That means we're going to be attacking 6 times per second, and we're going to get more damage. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare to faster attacks as well. With faster attacks, we don't get as much attack rate because Multi-Strike has a huge attack rate multiplier. We only actually gain 30% attack rate, which would put us just north of 4 attacks per second. But you see that we gain 30.5% damage per second. Comparative to Multi-Strike, that's 5/6 roughly of what Multi-Strike gives. When you figure 36 versus 30, 5 out of 6. But, as I mentioned before, faster attacks will in fact increase the Val Double Strike clone's attack speed. So, because of that exact factor there, and really, if you're going to use Double Strike, you're not going to just ignore Val Double Strike and not use it. It's way too much damage to give up when you summon all 4 of the boys, and the boys go in with you and go ham. So here, I think faster attacks is probably the better option. Now we've got main. Alright. So, and then we see added fire right down and chance to bleed. Now we don't have any AoE coverage yet, so we're actually going to pick our AoE skill here. And generally, I would actually do this first. If I wanted to use GMP or Ancestral Call or anything like that, I would want to see all of the increases in our damage, factoring whatever less multiplier is on our initial option. So our options here are Melee Splash or Ancestral Call. And truth be told, neither are right and neither are wrong. Oftentimes, they are actually utilized together, as it gives you a really comfortable amount of clear. But since we have something like Hemophilia to kind of cover our clear speed a little bit, we're a little bit more willing to kind of play with the numbers and figure out exactly what we want out of this. So, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to go with Melee Splash. And the reason for this is that it means that we're getting more damage more often. Ancestral Call does unfortunately come with a reduced damage, a less damage tag on it. So it would cut our damage a little bit and give us the 2 extra guys that swing into the pack. That might not honestly be necessary, and Splash might be honestly enough to kind of get the job done. And to my knowledge, Splash can inflict bleeding because of the hit. But if we do test, like, if we do end up on Val Double Strike and we test Splash and we feel like the bleed isn't consistent in the area around our target, then maybe we switch to Ancestral Call later. So we're going to put in Melee Splash. And that doesn't really change our damage. So now we're going to look at our last option. And here we have this conundrum. I mentioned Brutality earlier, and it's pretty much one of the most like raw more multipliers that you can get. And we don't really need to worry about like conflict with Heralds because we could just run Herald of Purity. That's flat biz anyhow, and it wouldn't really be that bad. And it would honestly kind of give us more bodies with the whole boys strategy. We'd have the four boys from Valor Double Strike, the 4 boys from Herald of Purity. Not bad. We got 9 bodies attacking a boss. That's not too bad. Especially when you factor in like the curse on the enemy and everything like that. So we have that option, and we see that if we put Brutality on, we're going to go up to 52,000 DPS. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to turn this off. We're going to look at Maim. Maim is a wonderful support gem, as it also has on it the ability to increase damage taken by the enemy. So this is a great option to be an alternative to Brutality. So it has a more physical damage multiplier on it, which is what we're looking for. Gives us a 30% chance to maim, and then enemies maimed by supported skills, so whatever this is supporting, take 10 to 14% increased physical damage. That is going to increase our damage, the damage of our clones from Val Double Strike, and should we elect to go with Herald of Purity, the damage from Herald of Purity. And, comparatively speaking, as we mentioned, Brutality puts us at 52. We'll add Maim in, and then let's go to the Configuration tab, and we'll check that the enemy is in fact maimed. 49.6. So now you see that Maim is actually pretty comparable with Brutality. But the thing with Maim is that it doesn't have that drawback of dealing no non-physical damage. And that's a pretty important drawback. Because now we can use Etziri's Promise, we can use Taste of Hate, we can use Sin's Rebirth, and we can think about Herald of Ash if we want the Ignite overkill damage spread to assist with our clear. Whereas with Brutality, all of those options are straight out the window. The only damage increasing flasks that we get as far as uniques are concerned would be Lion's Roar. And Lion's Roar's knockback sometimes, more often than not, can be a burden rather than a boon. So, with this build, we're actually going to go ahead and say that Maim is our best source of extra damage. Now, we're at 49,000 damage, not factoring in what Herald will be best with our build or what flasks we want with our build yet. And that's fine. The idea here is that if we see a skill with our configuration set for all of these different skills that we could theoretically use to have good clear and a feel good build, if one is miles above the other, when we don't factor in what Herald will give us the most damage, what flasks will give us the most damage, chances are minor differences between, like, maybe we use this flask on build A and we don't use it on build B, or maybe we use Herald of Ash on one build and we use Herald of Purity or Herald of Thunder on another build. Chances are these aren't going to make large enough differences with all the minor details, since every build is going to use a Herald and every build is going to use some setup of flasks. To accommodate, like, we see that Double Strike is 50,000 DPS, and then you can add in 4 instances of 10,000 DPS for bosses, so we have like 90,000 boss DPS as is. Now let's say, for instance, that we Smite, and Smite's got 190,000 DPS when we get done here. Well, alright. I mean, Val Double Strike's probably not competing with Smite if you get that high. Mark, we'll talk about that later. That's not part of what we're focused on right now. So, because of that, that's why we're going to do everything generic, and then we'll look to specialize later. So we're going to get rid of Brutality here. Now, we're going to move down to Lacerate. And we're going to leave Maimed and Bleeding on, because guess what? I wouldn't be surprised if Maim ends up as our best support, or as one of our best supports. But for proof's sake, we'll uncheck Maim. We'll leave Bleed because Lacerate is, again, a bleed-oriented build. And then Chilled because of the Axe. Okay. And again, anybody in chat, if you have any question regarding any part of what I'm doing here as we're going, please, 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 just put it in chat. I would much rather stop in the middle of explanations here and cover questions that somebody has. And since the chat will be on the highlight, along with the fact that I will address the chat question verbally in case for whatever reason the chat display isn't actually on the highlight. That way, those questions are brought up and answered right there regarding whatever the question is, so that way on the highlight it's also covered. But, as I mentioned, Lacerate's a bleed skill, so let's start again. So, and let's remember to change this, because you see everything was just kind of in a weird order here. We're going to change this to Lacerate now. And we're going to do both slashes. And the reason for this is that we more care about our boss damage than anything. Or at least, our tanky or enemy damage. And if it's one tanky enemy, we're going to be able to Lacerate directly in their face so that they get hit by both of the slashes that go out for Lacerate. So we want to see the damage factoring both slashes. Kind of similar in the vein that we looked at Double Strike and Val Double Strike, because we'll also get the clones. And I'm going to write this stuff down so that way we can come back to it later. So Val Double Strike had roundabouts 90k generic DPS. So let's do Lacerate. Conk Effect. This is one that is a little more up in the air. Also, something to note that I mentioned in the last one, our area effect type deal, like Melee Splash or Ancestral Call, this isn't going to matter for Lacerate. Lacerate kind of just shoots 2 wind slashes out in front of you that are going to hit everything that gets caught by it. So, instead of needing Melee Splash or Ancestral Call to instantiate more area coverage, we kind of just swing away with Lacerate, and we'll hit everything anyhow. We see melee physical damage, that's always a gimme. We see Brutality, but as I mentioned before, Brutality is a trap. Now, Conk Effect. So we see Lacerate's radius here, 57. Now that's not an actual AoE of 57. It means that our waves go out to a distance of 57 units. You can see roughly equivocable from the screenshot there that is half to 2/3 of the screen worth of coverage. Now, Conk Effect for any kind of area skill like this is generally always going to be one of, if not your best, more multiplier that you can fit into the build. The question always ends up being, is it worth the reduction in area coverage for the damage? So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and click Conk Effect. We now see that it drops our radius from 57 to 48. We're going to look and we're going to see that, well, we didn't lose a lot. You see that white line that's right past the blue line? We have the green circle, and then we have the blue line that's just outside. That blue line is 50. So we know that we were at 57, so we can look and see that most of the way to the next white line past the blue line would be where we would normally be if we didn't have Conk Effect. I don't know about you, but this kind of range looks pretty frickin' reasonable to me. I would never ever complain about it. So we're going to give Conk Effect a thumbs up. It will fit into our 6-link for this build. Bloodlust, again, same trap as Double Strike. Brutality, Endurance Charge on Melee Sun, again, just go back if you missed or if you're coming in some way part through. Go back to my explanation about how our build is going to function and why I'm not sold on this yet. But if we test the shield and feel that the shield is maybe more of a detriment than a boon, this could see its way into our builds later. Hypothermia. As I mentioned, expect to see this on a lot of our setups, especially the Pure Fizz ones, because we do have Soul Taker. Ruthless, again, it's the every 3 thing. What if we want to kill in 1 or 2? It's not really efficient at that point. Multi-Strike, as I mentioned before, now that we're not dealing with Val Double Strike, Multi-Strike and its absolute insane levels of attack speed that it gives you, generally going to kind of dump on a lot of other more multipliers we could put into our build. And then Chance to Bleed. And all things considered, given that we just had Multi-Strike, Chance to Bleed, not really surprising. It's got a really, really fat amount of added fizz that's going to synergize with everything else that we have. And it's also going to have the extra side effect of bringing us up to like 95% chance to bleed on this exact setup, meaning that we won't actually need to worry about investing our points here, because as such, our Lacerate is already over or at 100% chance to bleed. So, boom. A-okay. That looks beautiful to me. We don't need to worry at all about fitting anything else into our build regarding bleed. And that means that our future points could either be additional tankiness or additional more generic damage on the tree. We did spec out of something like Hatchet Master, and we've got nodes like Born to Fight and Strong Arm that are not too far away, along with By the Blade. All of these nodes would more than likely be more point efficient than Red Storm, and if we already have 100% chance to bleed, we don't honestly need something like that. Hell, you could even look at this. Like, it's increased damage with bleeding, which we don't care about, but 40% attack damage against bleeding enemies could actually end up being not too bad of an option. But regardless, we're going to have chance to bleed. And this all adds up to 41,000 DPS. Now, that's significantly lower on single target than Val Double Strike, but that's because Val Double Strike gets to dump the clones out. If we look at purely the skill, we're looking at 50 versus 41,000. All things considered, not too big of a difference. Now, I'm going to do that just for simplicity's sake. Now we're going to move on to the lightning builds, which would be Smite or Lightning Strike. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to take Hemophilia off. We are no longer on builds that give a shit about inflicting bleed on the enemy. Doesn't really scale us at all. So with that, we're also going to go and we're going to uncheck bleed. One thing to note actually that we should actually look at with Lacerate, turn off chance to bleed. Let's add Maim, and let's turn on Maim. Maim is just slightly worse than chance to bleed here. Alright. So, we're going to work on Smite now. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to not check either vulnerability or conductivity. And we're going to come back to this to see later which curse is better. This one I'm a little bit iffy about. I'm not sure what percentage of our damage is going to end up coming from what. And I assume Don't tell me that was affecting Lacerate. It was. It only looks like 300, so let's say like 40k and 49k just for simplicity's sake or something like that. I forgot about that stupid button. Alright, so Smite. This is going to enable the aura that we get from Smite. And now we're just going to start looking at our damage. So we see Conk Effect. Do we actually... Is Smite... Oh no, we're in Lacerate now. I don't know what the AoE on Smite actually is. Does anybody know if we have details on how big of an area it covers? It gets plus radius, so I can't imagine that it's too bad. Well, alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to ignore Conk Effect because we're not exactly sure if it is or isn't going to be worth it. And same thing again with Endurance Charge. So we got Melee Fizz, Hypothermia, Skip Bloodlust. Why is Bloodlust even here? Forgot to uncheck enemy is bleeding. Skip Ruthless. We have now we're looking at added fire. So this is kind of weird. And this is signifying that the Fizz component that we have in place for our build is kind of already pushing us to where added fire would be better. And it's better, so we're going to take it. Now we have elemental damage with attacks. And we could go elemental focus, but we're going to go multi-strike because it's going to help our speed. We're at 19,000, but that's because we don't have a curse up yet. Now we're going to look. Vulnerability would give us 1,600. Conductivity would give us 39. Flammability would give us 25. And I guess I actually have to do elemental weakness here. Elemental weakness gives us 57 because the added fire pushed us into a situation where we can get the most of it. So this is actually kind of interesting. We see that Smite is suspiciously lower on the DPS. Now, again, our gloves are kind of going to be up in the air because we don't need hemophilia exactly, so we have a little bit more flexibility to, let's just say we have, like, pretty generic spiked gloves. Maximum implicit melee damage. And let's say we got crafted attack speed, which I think is like, yeah, somewhere around 10. So we'll add this to the build for our elemental builds. And we've got about 28,000 DPS, which is notably lower. But the big thing is that Smite does kind of cover a pretty reasonable area, if I'm not mistaken. And it could be something like we drop added fire and we add Conk Effect, or... Oh, right. I guess that is kind of a thing, isn't it? Alright, so let's say we're going not elemental weakness. Let's say we go conductivity. Herp derp. We've got hypo, phase to lightning, which would make us go pure lightning damage. Multi-strike, because we want the speed. And then we have our choice kind of between like Conk Effect or some other stuff. Conk Effect would put us to like 31,000. Oh no, WED. Duh. So yeah, we're at like 31,000 now because I was adult and forgot that the curse actually would influence our support gens. And we see that that's actually a little bit higher than what the added fire was. So we pretty much have what would be our Smite setup. And we don't, with Smite, we don't need to worry about Ancestral Call or Melee Splash because it already hits an AoE. The thing that we aren't factoring here is that Smite has a chance to shock. It's not an unsubstantial one. It is 19% chance to shock. However, the big thing to note here is that shock calculation in POB has not been updated because the way they reworked shock, that it cares more about their enemy's health now and how much like damage you deal. Shocked always factors the old way, which was 50% more, and very rarely are you going to get 50% more anymore. So we have Smite at about 32k, so honestly, not too far below everything else. Now we're going to go to Lightning Strike, and we know for a fact, actually this should be Val Lightning Strike. We know for a fact with Val Lightning Strike that we're going to want lightning damage anyways, so we're going to keep ourselves on Conductivity. And again, we're going to focus more on the actual Lightning Strike and less on the Val version, as the Val version is just kind of an added bonus. And then we're going to also focus more on the melee hit, as the projectiles kind of are just extra coverage. Now we're going to go down to Val Lightning Strike, and we're going to get going. So we've got, this is actually a first that we're going to see added lightning be so highly rated for a gem. Then we have elemental damage with attacks, hypothermia, multi-strike, because we're going to want the quality of the multi-strike attack speed. Usually you're going to want some kind of attack speed modifier, whether it's multi-strike or faster attacks on your build. In this case, it's something similar to what I would do with Ancestral Call, where I would usually grab it earlier. But if there was a skill where like the other modifiers just drown multi-strike out, I would honestly consider going a little bit slower of a build. And then we have elemental focus, and with this, we actually could contemplate, we can't crit, and we don't have innate opportunity to shock with this build. At least I don't think that Lightning Strike has the innate chance to shock. And the big thing here that I want to double down on, you see me going back and forth with the wiki, be willing to do that. Because you might have an idea for your build and not know all the items that you need to put in the piece for the puzzle. Or you're doing what I'm doing, where you kind of had the item build set up, but you don't know what skill you want to use. Don't be afraid to constantly like go back and like do different levels of research on the wiki. You know, if you are endurance charge centric, you saw how I showed scrolling down the endurance charge page, we saw like how to get more of them and what we could do with them that was kind of interesting and maybe even broken. We don't know yet. But regarding what I was checking, Lightning Strike does not feature a chance to shock. And I don't believe Val Lightning Strike does either. No, it just has can't be evaded, which is actually kind of useless for us. So, elemental focus sounds good. We don't care about shocking with this build. So we see we get to 40,000 DPS. And once again, this isn't a bleed build, so we don't really need Hemophilia. Consecrated Path, now we're going towards the fire build, so we're going to swap ourselves the flammability ahead of time. Now, Consecrated Path is an interesting one that I haven't fucked with yet, so I'm curious to see what these numbers look like. Do we have AoE for Consecrated Path? No, we don't. So again, we're gonna ignore Conk Effect because we don't know what the area is like. So we don't know if we are willing to take the hit to the area to shrink it. We see added fire. That makes sense because it's already a fizz to fire conversion build, so it's gonna play well with our damage anyhow here. Wed, melee physical, all these not really surprising. Ruthless or Hypothermia, and this is the one where multi-strike doesn't work. So now we kind of come down to giving up our chance to ignite, which we don't really. Does Consecrated Path have an innate chance to ignite? I'm not sure, so we're going to go back to Consecrated Path. I know I was here earlier, but I didn't take in everything. No. Okay, so it does not actually give us any ability to ignite the enemy, so Elemental Focus seems completely reasonable. we've got 3.5 attacks per second, so we could theoretically think about faster attacks too if we wanted to. Or, chance to bleed and maim are here like they usually always are. The big thing though is that this puts us at 31.9. I don't think maim could compete. It's a little short. The other thing that we also can't factor with Consecrated Path is whether or not POB factors this line, which is deals up to 20% more damage to closer targets. This is something we'd have to honestly test in game, and it could be that I wouldn't be surprised if this isn't factored in, given that even with everything that we've set up here, we're at 31,000. Now, let's say, well, we went down the list and hypothermia was definitely lower than conk. So let's say we did go conk, and then we would be going hypothermia instead of elemental focus. We're still only at like 35. So I'm actually going to put concentrated effect in because we get AoE from our charges, but I also noticed here that the quality is actually also more increased area of effect. So we do have some good factors here to kind of offset concentrated effect. And I want to give Con's Path a little bit more competition. Granted, it still only gets us to 35k, and that's definitively lower than most of our other options. Now, the next two here, I'm expecting to maybe kind of blow the math open and kind of ruin everything. And that's Infernal Blow and Molten Strike. So we'll switch to Infernal Blow. Added Fire, Melee Fizz, LE Damage, Multi-Strike, always, and Hypothermia. Or we could theoretically go Elemental Focus, but, Hypothermia is pretty good too. 25,000. Now, if I'm not mistaken, we still do not... Well, I guess I should have had that checked all the time. Big note here with Infernal Blow is that it does not factor the explosion. But we can try to do some math. So we have Infernal Blow. We see that a level 20 Infernal Blow hits for 122.8, and the debuff does 66% per charge. So we can kind of theorize that a maximum power explosion, because I believe it stacks to 6, a maximum power explosion should hit for roughly triple our damage. We also see that we attack 6 times a second for an average damage of 3,850 per hit. So what that means is that we can kind of take that 3,850, I'm going to get my phone for a calculator. There is a little bug on my phone. I'm not sure what it was, but it's gone now. So we have 3,850 times 3 roughly. That means that we'd be adding about another 11,500 to the DPS. And that's because we have 6 attacks per second. And that brings us up to about 37,000. Now, the other thing I didn't do here, which is kind of notable, is that this is actually something where you definitely want Splash or Ancestral Call. I think actually, I forget, is it Splat? Wait, you want one specifically. Okay, Melee Splash. Okay, so Splash would theoretically be maybe a little bit lower, but there could be other options that would scale it harder, just because of how much kind of damage. And it just with Melee Splash, it has absolutely insane clear speed synergy to begin with. But for what it's worth, it looks kind of mediocre on paper. Actually, we lost even like a little more damage. And we're gonna come to Molten Strike, the pinnacle offender of all things DPS calculation. So the first thing we've got to do is add our wildfires, because you're not going to run a Molten Strike build without these bastards. That's a good spot. That's a good spot. Okay, so these are now, we'll double check. We have the strength and radius. Excellent. So this means that our Molten Strike fires 2 additional projectiles, which, if I'm not mistaken, would give a grand total of 7. 6. Or no, additional. 6 or 7. We'll say 6, just for sake of this maybe not shitting on every other skill. P.S. I kind of don't want to play Molten Strike with this build anyway, so I probably won't. But for the sake of completion of the tutorial here, let's do Molten Strike. So Molten Strike is definitely fire, definitely multi-strike, and with this, Ancestral Call actually isn't just additional area of effect. If you stand at a certain distance away from a single target enemy with Ancestral Call and just swing into the air with attack in place, you will cause the balls from your swing that hits the air to come out, and some amount will land on the enemy. But because you're also far enough away to not be in like melee range of the enemy, your Ancestral Call buddy will actually spawn behind the boss and drop a second set of balls onto the enemy. And the notable thing about Molten Strike is that every single fucking ball that you drop can hit the enemy. So you can effectively, what we call, shotgun with it. If you drop 40 balls a second and 30 of them hit the enemy, that is 30 instances of damage hitting the enemy. So we'll go with Ancestral Call. And then Wed. Not really surprising to see a full red for Molten Strike. It's pretty disgusting as is. And we're going to have to do a little bit of math again. So we have 20,000 melee DPS. This is hard locked no matter what with this skill. But let's look at the projectile damage. Every ball... Oh, is it actually like trying to factor this? Does this reduce my... Not really. No? Okay, so this isn't really factoring correctly. I believe this is per projectile, if I remember right. So that means that, on average, our projectiles are going to do something like this. With the attack speed that we have of 6.6, and then we do 6, at minimum like 12 balls per swing, times 6 attacks a second, is 72 balls per second, roughly. Now, if you look at the damage that we have here, and we figure maybe half of those 72 find their mark, then suddenly we're looking at 36 additional hits. Even if we factor this right here, that's another 36,000 DPS. And this is kind of why I said, you know, I expect this, but Molten Strike generally would outperform just about everything. What would make this even worse is that point blank, if we go projectile distance 1, we see that point blank would basically be a 50% DPS increase. And guess what? Those balls don't really travel that far, all things considered. So then we're suddenly looking at 1,500 per instead of 1,000 per. And now that 36,000 is 48,000. Molten Strike is kind of a notorious offender for just ruining DPS calculations. And pathing to point blank, we could pass Hatchet Master and grab Hatchet Master and get all the benefits that Hatchet Master would give us with extra attack speed and extra damage, and then end up with point blank on top of that. So the routing that would go into Molten Strike specifically would be kind of disgusting, and all things considered. If I was really trying to maximize every little bit of this build, I would play Molten Strike. But I've played Molten Strike before. I don't really want to play it again yet. And it's more fun when you play it as a Raider and you have 12 or 14 attacks per second. Because take all that balls math and double it from what we just did. Because we have about 6.5 attacks per second. Take a Raider with 13 attacks per second. There is shit everywhere when you wreck a boss. So, with all this said, I'm pretty sure that I want to try either Lacerate or Double Strike. And because I've never actually personally done a Val Double Strike build that is like purely Double Strike centric, we're actually going to more than likely play this build as a Double Striker. So, means that we're going to be Vulnerability. Means that we're going to be using Hemophilia. There's a reason I bought the Hemophilias off of Unity when we dropped them together earlier in the week. We don't really need these wildfires anymore. And let's check everything. I feel like I am missing some math here. Oh, that's what I'm missing. Bleeding. And actually, Double Strike had Maim. Yep. Bleeding and Maim. Okay. Now we're kind of back up to where we were. So, now that we've kind of settled on the what of the build, the meat, what are we going to beat the living shit out of everything with? And that answer is Val Double Strike. We've got one more question that I had earlier, which is, what are we going to do with that last 30% of our mana? And I said it was probably going to be a Herald. So now, what Herald is it going to be? By clicking new, we're going to get, like, what is the best DPS increases for our build? And as we scroll down, we see that Herald of Purity and Herald of Ash are very, very similar, in fact. So it's going to come down to, do I want the extra minions from Herald of Purity, even though I'm not really scaling them? Or do I want the extra consistency of Herald of Ash giving me that overkill damage kind of spreading around? And if I'm not mistaken, Herald, I need to double check because it's been an eternity since I've used Herald of Ash. I don't believe the spread damage cares what it was. Nope, it's just of overkill. And with the combination of Hemophilia, truth be told, we could be looking at some decent amounts of overkill. So we're going to use Herald of Ash to boost our damage. Now, we're going to come back to our tree because we were only level 89. And we're going to look around and see what we can do with some of our nodes. So these nodes are not really going to be that efficient because we don't really have too much Ellie damage. We already grabbed Berserking. Chances are this would be one of our best increases. We see that it would be a 15% DPS increase if we could get over there. But it is 7 points, and that's a little bit more than I want in the build. So we're going to look around. I mentioned Strong Arm earlier. That's actually a 13% DPS increase for a whopping 5 points. But that's actually even cheaper. Because, remember how I rerouted things a little bit earlier? We're going to reroute them again. So as is right now, this would put us at 117 points. We're going to reconnect this. This makes Strong Arm a little bit less potent. But we picked up this along the way, which gave us some good damage. But it's only 3 points. And now we're going to kind of reroute this build. So this is the faster way to get down here. And now we get to chop off a bunch of points. And we see that we actually end at 118. So technically, the other route would actually be more efficient. So that's fine. We're just going to go ahead and quickly reset the old route back into place. And I have a feeling that Bloodless might have something to do with that. So if we come over here, we're at 117 now. I'm not really fully considering that that's the best option yet. We've got By the Blade here, and this would be a 10% increase for 4 points. At that point, I'd probably just invest into Strong Arm. We look around to see what other damage or attack speed that we can pick up. We don't really actually have that much. We are using a shield. Perhaps these nodes, 6, 8, 10. We could drop this point then. Now we're at 115 and we gained a little bit less damage, so this might actually be like the correct routing to handle. And more so, we could even route this build massively differently to cut out some of these travel points too. More so, we could go, so we're at 115 now, we could go here, here, and here, and drop this, and that's our connector up there. Never mind. That was me missing some stuff. We don't need that point anymore. I thought we were at 115. Do I have an, oh, I do have, oh no, we take this and we drop these two. That's what it is. Okay. So now we're at like 115, 92, 60,000 DPS. Our double strike is at 12.9. That's pretty good too. And all things considered, I'd be pretty comfortable with that. We've got a good amount of jewel sockets too. And we still have some open space. So we're going to go and look at flasks now. And we're going to sort by DPS. Now we're going to see Lion's Roar immediately. And that's the one I'm skeptical of because of the knockback. So we're going to skip that. Sin's Rebirth gives us Unholy Might when we have it. Unholy Might gives us 30% of our physical damage as added as chaos damage. That sounds pretty good, and as an added bonus, it's a Stibnite Flask. So we're going to add that to the build. And Adziri's Promise is also pretty damn good. So we're going to add Adziri's Promise to the build. I'm going to turn that on. Now, we see Taste of Hate. Honestly, that's probably our next best option. And then we're kind of borderlining on a really expensive build. Alternatively, we could just get Onslaught and Sulfur. And that's what we're going to actually opt for to give us the additional utility flasks. So we're going to add a Sulfur. We'd probably want like Experimenters of Staunching so that we don't get bled by enemies. And then we're going to want a Silver Flask for Onslaught to give us more damage. And that will probably also be an Experimenters of... We're already kind of freeze immune from Calm's Roots, so we don't need that. We have our bleed immunity, so chances are we probably want curse immunity here as our best option. And then this last slot more than likely would be a life flask because we are a life-based build. Now our resistances are a little sketchy. We do have 3 slots that are probably going to be very, very heavily dependent on resistances and not much else, but honestly, that's not really ever that bad of an option. Now, what I like to do sometimes is I like to look at my 4 links. So now that we have all of our information, we can do this and go Vitality, Blasphemy, if I can spell correctly, Vulnerability, and our Herald. And we see, delete this, we see that we have a 3 red and a blue. That's one of our 4 links. We have 3 red and an X. This is probably going to be a golem. And then that's it for our 4 links. So Both of these are going to be 3 reds, so we can use a pure armor base and feel good. So we would look at something like an Eternal Bergonet. And we would want, like, just resistances. Don't really care about the armor. Just life and resist. We're going to be probably expecting to pay a little bit for these because we're funneling our resistances a little harder in the fewer slots. We're going to want a belt, and because we're going to probably want to keep this a little bit more budget friendly as we're already running up the bank, we're just going to do a life tri-res leather belt. Because getting a Stygian Vice while the extra jewel socket could help would generally run the cost up a little bit higher. And then Amulet, we don't really need to worry about being too greedy. Let's look at our stats. We see that we need a shit fucking load of dexterity and some int. So we definitely want a dexterity int amulet. This actually could end up being an issue moving forward with the build. And it might be an issue that we need to address. I believe my original build wasn't using the apple because I didn't know it existed yet. And was using just a beefy fuck ton of resistance Archon. Also, because of that, we were always guaranteed to be at 10 endurance charges, so we knew we would always have the endurance charges from the shield, or from the, we'd always have the elemental resistances from the endurance charges. There we go. Use my words. So we want Dex Int. It'll be max implicit. And we see that we're going to need a little bit of all stats to actually kind of cover our int, and then we'll figure out what we're going to do with our dexterity. Let's say we get like all res and fire res or something like that, and life. We're not going to worry about getting damage on any of this because it would only exponentially increase the price. So now we see that we're able to like kind of get towards cap, but this dexterity is kind of an issue. So we're going to look at whether we can reroute our tree at all to pick up stuff that would get us dexterity. And the first thing we kind of see is the Hatchet Master that I mentioned earlier. And we could drop Berserking to get Hatchet Master. It has comparable attack speed. Grats, you did better than I did. I don't know what the hell you did, but that was absolutely atrocious for me earlier. So we're going to drop the attack speed, and we're going to come down here and get Hatchet Master. We're going to swap that to the dexterity node that I mentioned earlier. And this gives us a bunch of dexterity along the way. The issue now is that we're at level 96, so we're going to need to trim somewhere else. And probably going to look to be splitting strikes here. It's one of our lesser efficiency damage nodes. Could also be that like maybe we shouldn't be this far up, but I like the Chaos Rose. Okay, yeah. You did what I wasn't willing to do, which is grind a fuck ton. Apparently what other people were saying was that the correct move was buying a Thunder Rod in Mist Village, which is the only shop I didn't check. And that allowed you to get past Kenazo. And that started to open the seat up a little bit. I don't blame you. Did you have Cecil? Because apparently Cecil was the character that everybody was missing. But regardless, for sake of staying on topic, because I'm going to highlight this later. I'll talk to Jacob about that in a minute. Yeah, so we're going to come over to Hatchet Master, get us some dexterity, and now we're looking a little bit more reasonable. So we see we need 8 more dexterity, so now we can go back to this turquoise amulet that we made and look for a little bit higher of an all stat roll. And save. And voila. We're pretty much set on our stats. Resistances were a little bit lacking. we could tune up some of our numbers. Or alternatively, we have some jewel sockets, so we're probably going to have to invest in resistance here. But I don't really need to put them in because it's something I could factor in later. You know, maybe we don't get a Sin's Rebirth. Maybe we can just slot, maybe we can just slot, what's it called? A Bismuth Flask. Perhaps going 10 endurance charges with Calm's roots isn't actually correct. Maybe we actually go 9 endurance charges using both of the rings, and we just get a good pair of, like, two-tone boots that have... Or maybe we actually just get a pair of yellows with an endurance charge instead. So that way the yellows will at least have some resistances that we need, some life on it, and maybe some movement speed. And then we kind of solve our resistance issues right there while still getting our endurance charge. There's some flexibility depending on what we end up encountering once we get further on. Again, that flexibility is kind of what you want because you don't know what struggles you're going to come into. Maybe Calm's weighs double in price by the time I get this character to the maps. And I have to kind of like reevaluate everything. You know, if the Eternal Apple doesn't actually feel good, then suddenly we're slapping in a fat old Archon Kite Shield with like 100 something% total elemental resistance, and then we don't really need to sweat our elemental resistances at all. So that flexibility and knowing what the flexibility means in your head once you encounter struggles later on all matters to figure out how to push the build further later on. With this, we're going to save our, we'll call it our apple jug, because we're going to abuse the shit out of the stupid apple. And that pretty much covers how to, from start to finish, kind of theorycraft a build, starting with just an idea, and then working piece by piece and like using the resources of stuff like the wiki to kind of figure out the pieces of the puzzle that you need to put together in order to make your build complete in the end.